Welcome to this edition of Theological Journals, 9/27/2022. We conclude with the temptations of an evangelical theologian. Protestant temptation to Protestant liberalism. Protestant liberalism existed in the forefront of the meeting of the Evangelical Society. The members who gathered in 1949 asserted a distinct identity to the one hand, rejected the fundamentalistic impulse towards isolation, while simultaneously refuting the liberals' theological errors of liberal theologian and Protestantism. Fundamental was seen as a temptation. Liberal Protestantism was seen as the enemy. The temptation towards theological liberalism is not only substantial, but attitudinal. As a belief system, Protestant liberalism rose as an answer to the mocking of more enlightened and scientific culture. Decade by decade, doctrine by doctrine, liberal Protestants tried to chart a way that made Christianity palatable to the cultural and intellectual pressures of the day. The challenge was already culturally present during the time of the Friedrich Schleiermacher. The challenge is still with us today, but with greater intensity. If we buy into substantial temptation of liberalism, we lose orthodox theology. That will be the same result, moreover, if we give into the attitudinal temptations. Indeed, the ETS will surrender its convictions and doctrinal commitments if it attempts to create a more plausible, salvageable Christianity that will enjoy acceptance, whether in the halls of academia or among the engines of cultural production. Our task is not to salvage the Christian faith. Our responsibility is to hold fast to all that is contained in the Holy Scriptures and to contend for the faith until the end. In one sense, this is a daunting task. In another sense, however, it is exhilarating. The longer I live, the more I recognize that the chief responsibility of any generation is to pass on the faith intact to the coming generation. The task of the ETS in the coming years will require more theological conviction, not less. It will demand the resistance of these temptations that will no doubt continue to grow in intensity. This means at a practical level that the membership of the ETS must mean something. If we are to stand for the truth once for all delivered to the saints, that commitment must carry the weight of doctrinal accountability, theological fidelity, and rejection of moral ambiguity. This will require that the Evangelical Theological Society remain genuinely evangelical in every sense of the word. This conviction to stand may also require more of our doctrinal statements to clarify to the world where we stand as evangelical scholars and theologians. For example, there is nothing in the present bylaws or commitment of this society that would prevent a presidential address to be delivered by someone who identifies with a gender contrary to his or her chromosomal structure. Try explaining that sentence to one of the seminary's founders. We face the inevitable changes. We face the inevitable challenges that must be met our theological activity and production, our community as scholars and thinkers and theologians will stand or fall upon whether we face the tasks. May God, the great judge of all, find this society faithful and up to the task. The temptations are real. We must therefore run this race with endurance to the end for the glory of God. Professor Franicevich on Irenaeus and Harmonia in the Anglican Theological Review. Again, God bestows on creation with purpose. In 224, Irenaeus employs eschatological notions to introduce creation. To have created a thing is to have predestined it according to its assigned nature. And again, by describing their harmonious nature as having been assigned at the beginning of their creation, Irenaeus implies that their creation has an end. All animals feeding on the productions of the earth should become peaceful and harmonious among each other. Irenaeus concedes that those prophecies which apply to the case of savage men who, when they have believed, acted in harmony with the righteous, but insists that they also apply to those animals mentioned. His focus on harmonious relationships among the animals presses the point that God bestows harmonious natures on all kinds of living creatures. Irenaeus' musical notion of harmonia runs between the poles of God's bestowal of harmony at the beginning of creation and the symphony he completes in the millennium. In the meantime, despite the differences that exist among various created things, the one who believes in God's purpose for history can receive difference as different notes belonging to the same melody. When God does in forming man, choosing the patriarchs, preparing Israel, sending the prophets, blueprinting a plan for salvation, conducting a single symphony to which he harmonizes the whole human nature. For Irenaeus, the rhetorical purpose of God's work of the symphony of salvation is to account for the seemingly problematic discrepancies between God's work. Submission to God's creative work of salvation requires faith that all things do, in fact, hold together in a single beautiful song. Salvation is a symphony. The apostolic witness to salvation should be arranged and fitted together. Responding to the heretics who greeted some texts from the Old Testament more authority than others, Irenaeus demonstrated that all authors essentially agree with one another and witness to the same thing. The covenants differ from one another in many respects, but they too possess a unity and harmony. Having concluded that St. Paul's chronology of his travels in his epistle to the Galatians and Luke's chronology and Acts agree, Irenaeus says that Paul's statement harmonizes with and is identical with St. Luke's testimony. The purpose of 3:10 is to demonstrate that St. Matthew and Luke witness to the one true God in the opening chapters of their Gospels. The prophets, the Lord, and the apostles themselves are a harmonious witness to God's single symphony. Weird. Now for Anglican Theological Review, the August edition, Bozak. This is discussing Desmond Tutu. How could the churches fear these threats? Lethuthi seemed to be saying when the threats to the very lives of God's oppressed children were so much more real and so much more lethal every day, when so much was at stake. Bicco and the Black Consciousness generation felt no different. Their challenge to the church was as sharp as that of Chief Lethuthi. Even at this late stage, Bicco tells black pastors at a conference in the early 1970s, one notes the appalling irrelevance of the interpretation given to Scripture. In a country teeming with injustice and fanatically committed to the practice of oppression and blatant cruelty because of racial bigotry, in a country where all the black people are made to feel the unwanted stepchildren of a God whose presence they cannot feel, stern-faced ministers stand on pulpits every Sunday to heap loads of blame on black people in townships for their thieving, housebreaking, stabbing, murdering, and adultery. No one ever attempts to relate all these vices to poverty, unemployment, overcrowding, lack of schooling, and migratory labor. No one wants to completely condone aberrant behavior, but it is frequently necessary for us to analyze situations a little deeper than the surface suggests. So Bicco concludes that Christianity used by the white missionaries as the ideal religion for the colonization of the people is nowadays in the hands of the black church, and its interpretation of the Bible still the ideal religion for the maintenance of the subjugation of the same people. Frantz Fanon has made the point that colonization is a veritable apocalypse that destroys the personhood of its victims. This situation does not only cause collective trauma, it becomes intensely personal, causing calamitous inner conflicts. Because it is a systematic negation of the other person and a furious determination to deny other person all the attributes of humanity, colonialism forces the people it dominates to ask themselves the constant question in reality, who am I? The Black Consciousness generation, with their decolonized minds, understood this existential question extraordinarily well, and they shouted from the rooftops who they knew themselves to be. They translated Fanon's individualized question into a communal question, a transracial, transcultural, transreligious question. With that self-understanding, they swamped the streets of Soweto and the rest of the country in flaming protest and fiery resistance. And with that self-understanding, they challenged the churches. For those students and youth who were Christians, this is how they responded to Jesus' question. Their Christian identity was spelled out in commitment and sacrifice, in pain and blood on the streets of confrontation. The apartheid state, like some leviathan stirring under the sea, rose up in fear-filled rage and let the waves of vengeful wrath crash over the children. This time the churches seemed to listen, but it was the prophetic church that was heard and acted and gave such sterling leadership in the struggle between 1979 and 1990, after Desmond Tutu took over the leadership of the council in March 1978. It was a year that heralded an extraordinary epoch. Desmond Tutu's leadership heralded a fundamental transformation of the SACC as he created room for the radical theological self-expression of the new generation of Black clergy and theologians, all of them organically rooted in the struggles of the people. We turn our attention now to Trinity Journal and the article on John's Gospel and John 10:10. Dr. Lau and the Gospel of John. Different article. Second, biography emphasizes character-revealing incidents and thus is less exhaustive than histories. Plutarch, the ancient theologian and biographer, differentiates between biography and history. I do not tell all the famous actions of these men, nor even speak exhaustively at all in each particular case, but in epitome. For it is not histories that I am writing, but lives. And in the most illustrious deeds, there is not always a manifestation of virtue or vice. Nay, a slight thing like a phrase or a jest often makes a greater revelation of character than battles where thousands fell. Accordingly, just as painters get the likenesses of their portraits from the face and expression in their eyes, when the character shows itself, so I must be permitted to devote myself rather to the signs of the soul in men, and by means of these, to portray the life of each, leaving to others the description of the great contests. History describes all the famous actions that a person did and their historical consequences. Biography, however, selects only those details that reveals a person's character and gives insight to the soul of men. Biography uses historical data, but it does so selectively, because the main interest in portraying in a portrait of words and deeds the historical character of an historical person who is seen as an example. The selective nature of the fourth gospel is readily seen, where the author admits that if everything Jesus did was written down, the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. Most important is the criteria of selection. John 20:30-31 states, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Nonetheless, these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Jesus performed many signs. Nonetheless, the fourth gospel only selects those which especially reveal Jesus to be the Messiah, the Son of God. The author's selectivity regarding his sources echoes Plutarch's own selectivity in writing biography. Anglican and Episcopal history on Absalom Jones. Absalom Jones and Mary Thomas were also aware of the Anglican entries for publication in newspapers announcing the church marriages of enslaved couples, adding to the hope that such marriages might give them this family stability needed to resist slavery. The same year they were married, they pursued Thomas's manumission. They raised the money with the help of the Thomas's father, John Thomas, and persuaded Sarah King, her slaveholder, to grant the manumission. As Jones recounted, her mistress agreed for the sum of £40. They did not have the money, however, but Jones said he got an appeal drawn and, with the help of his father-in-law, called upon some of the principal friends, meaning Quakers, in Philadelphia. The couple borrowed from some of these Quakers and received donations from others, raising £30, which King accepted, foregoing the balance of £10. Wynkoop attended Christ Church and St. Peter's, where King was also a parishioner. Wynkoop became a vestry member, but like other parishioners, was opposed to manumission. Jones stated that his duties to the Wynkoops increased after his marriage. The prospect of his manumission diminished even further under the increased workload associated with his enslavement. The couple eventually raised enough money to repay the loans for Thomas's manumission. They also acquired the considerable sum they knew Wynkoop would require for Jones's manumission. As Jones wrote, I took a house and for 7 years made it my business to work until 12 or 1 o'clock at night to assist my wife in obtaining a livelihood and to pay the money that was borrowed to purchase her freedom. This being fully accomplished and having a little money in hand, I made application to my master in the year 1778 to purchase my own freedom. Wynkoop, however, rejected the application. Jones and Thomas were married by the rector of Christ Church, Jacob Duchy, 1737 to 1798. An advocate of preserving the status quo. Pick that up as we go. We turn now to the Historical Society, $16,000 in grants. Historical Society of the Episcopal Church announced the awarding of $16,000 in grants to 12 recipients during the annual meeting, July 27. Over the past decade, the Historical Society has provided $100,000 in grants to nearly 100 recipients. Applications are considered by the Grants and Research Committee and determined by the Historical Society's Board of Directors. They're encouraged to share their research and projects, especially in Anglican and Episcopal history, the peer-reviewed quarterly journal of the Historical Society. Grant recipients. M.A. candidate, University of Nebraska at Kearney, to research the role of embroidered book bindings in religious lives of early England. Devin Burns, Ph.D. candidate at Florida State University, to study the Confederate Episcopal Church and the relationship to the making of the Lost Cause historiography. Mongeza Gurma, Canon Anglican Church of South Africa, to research Sister Alberta Nagudel, a religious sister from Twalzo, who founded in 1919 an African female religious community of St. John the Baptist. Laura Hernandez Erisman, faculty member, Department of History, Austin Community College, to research the place of slavery and race relations in the history of St. David's Episcopal Church in Austin. Stephen Kapinda, lecturer, Religion and Public Life, Sewanee University, to investigate the long-standing and ambiguous history of the Anglican Church and the ex-slaves' descendants at Freretown in Kenya. Simon Lewis, independent scholar, to study doctrinal debate in the early 18th century Church of Ireland, focused on the contributions made by clergyman Edward Nicholson. Don Mitchell, independent scholar, for research on Francis Perkins and the religious dimensions of the New Deal by placing it within the context of the Episcopal Church's role in social mission. Daphne Noyes, independent scholar, to continue her research on the life of Adeline Blanchard Taylor, 1805-1875, the first deaconess in the Episcopal Church. Donna Ray, senior lecturer in history and religious studies at the University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, to research the voices of laymen, especially their soft power in shaping the Episcopal Church in the American Deep South. Bart Sego, PhD candidate in systematic theology, St. Paul's University, Kenya, studied the influence of liberation theology upon John Henry Akulu and his pursuit for social justice in Kenya. Diocese of Mississippi to digitize 5 audio cassettes and 33 VHS tapes, which will include sharing the stories online through the diocesan website. Diocese of Milwaukee for the collection and dissemination of oral histories of the Milwaukee Diocese of the Episcopal Church. Turn our attention to table talk and Exodus 22, 1 through 6, laws about property rights. The Book of the Covenant, Exodus 21 to 23, applies the 10 Commandments to life in ancient Israel, giving the ancient covenant community an understanding of how to keep God's law in particular situations. In turn, these laws help us to apply the 10 Commandments to our own concerns. We covered Exodus 22, 2 to 3a, in an earlier study, so we will not want to discuss it here, except to say that it endorses lethal force in self-defense, if that is the only other option to protect innocent life. Verses 1 and 3b4 give the penalties for theft. The general principle is that the thief must compensate the person whom he has wronged for his loss, that the more theft harms the innocent party, the more there is to repay. Oxen took longer to reach maturity than sheep, and they were vital on Israelite farms, being the animals used to accomplish much of the manual labor required. Thus a thief had to repay 5-fold for stealing an ox, but only 4-fold for stealing a sheep. This penalty was imposed only if the animal actually died while in the possession of the thief. Judges were to reduce the penalty to double the loss when the animal was returned to the owner alive. Leviticus 6:1-6 confesses the crime. Judges in ancient Israel used these guidelines. Exodus 22:5-6 explains what to do when one causes another person's property by negligence. We will bring that to a close as we've got someone here at the house. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen.